Can the market trust US data after the Bureau of Labor Statistics chief was fired? This is Macro Matters, and we're talking the US job market. The US economy added just 73,000 jobs in July, while the numbers for the previous 2 months were revised down by a massive 258,000. But it was President Trump's reaction to that data that really surprised observers. He fired the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which collects the data, raising fears over whether the numbers will be credible in the future. Mark Fleming is chief economist at First American. Mark, firstly, what's going on in the US jobs market to cause this sharp easing?
Well, there's clearly a slowdown, certainly a slowdown in the amount of jobs that are being created. Employers are less likely to create jobs. They're also, based upon some data that was released this week, less likely to fire. So there's a slowdown on both sides of the equation, but it is clear the labor market is cooling. It was hot earlier. That's why wages were rising quickly. But there's definitely a trend towards less job creation. And if you lose your job, you're likely to stay unemployed for longer.
How did the numbers for May and June come to be so far out? What's happening with the data collection?
Well, as with other data collected in the US, as well as other countries, participation rates in the surveys that these agencies use has declined dramatically, particularly since the pandemic. And so when you collect less data, you get smaller samples in those earlier periods. And so you can revise more heavily as more and more of that data comes in. This is a pattern we've seen throughout the last 20 or 30 years. In fact, while the changes or the revisions were large this time around, they're not unprecedented. There have been similar changes that have been this large 3 or 4 times in the last 20 years.
Does that mean that markets and indeed economists like yourself can rely on the data going forward?
Yeah, just because less samples are smaller doesn't mean that the results are biased in some way. In fact, studies have shown that even though the response rates are lower, the numbers are still as accurate as they were before. I say that a little bit tongue-in-cheek because if you dig into the data for these statistics, the confidence intervals on them are very, very large. Like in this case, over 130,000 plus or minus. So we state a number of 70, but it could easily be well over 100 or closer to 200 on the upside.
Obviously, these numbers have big consequences for the Fed. Are you now pricing in more rate cuts this year?
Well, the markets certainly are. After this happened, the market expectations for a rate cut in September went over 90%, which was about a 10 or 15% increase in the odds, if you will. And so I think there is more belief that this cooling labor market is going to pressure the Fed in September to do a rate cut.
Is this good news for American consumers, especially if they need a loan? Do you expect a shift in mortgage affordability even before the Fed moves?
In the old days, a Fed rate cut or the expectation of a Fed rate cut almost assured a reduction in mortgage rates. But as we saw in the last year and a half, there have been scenarios where the Fed cut rates and mortgage rates did not come down. So it's not a foregone conclusion. But this week, in response to this, the news of last week, we have seen the 10-year Treasury yield get closer to 4%, and mortgage rates have already come down about 20 basis points because of that.
President Trump picked his nominee for the open spot on the Fed's board this week, someone who's very likely to follow his calls to cut. But does that raise more worries over the Fed's independence?
I suppose yes. Anybody who is sort of being put in the Fed because of political motivation, possibly, but we have to remember the Federal Open Market Committee is 12 voting members. Even the chair themselves is one among equal. They don't have veto power. And so you'd have to convince all the other members of the voting board to make a move that would be against sort of what would be otherwise economically viable. So yes, certainly putting someone in of your liking is guides it in a different direction, but there's a lot of other people on that board.
That was Mark Fleming of First American. Don't forget, you can watch more videos on Reuters.com.